Today, my talk is intended for the 4th year English specialization student of University of Distance Education. The module number is Eng-4104, Translation and Interpretation 3. Let's study what is translation. What is translation? Translation is a phenomenon that has a huge effect on everyday life. This can range from the translation of a key in an action attractee to the following multilingual poster that welcomes customers to a small restaurant near the home of one of the authors. Translation. It is a noun. 1. The act or an instance of translating. 2. A written or spoken expression of the meaning of a word, speech, book, etc. in another language. This is the definition of the Concise Oxford English Dictionary. Translation is an incredibly broad notion which can be understood in many different ways. For example, one may talk of translation as a process or a product, and identifying such subtypes as literary translation, technical translation, subtitling, and machine translation. Moreover, while more typically it just refers to the transfer of written text, the term sometimes also includes interpreting. This definition introduces further variables. First, the subtypes, which include not only typically written products, such as literary and technical translations, but also translation forms that have been created in recent decades, such as audiovisual translation, a written product which is read in conjunction with an image on screen, cinema, television, DVD, or computer game. Moreover, the reference to machine translation reveals that translation is now no longer the precept of human translators, but in a professional context, increasingly a process and produce that marries computing power and the computerized analysis of language to the human's ability to analyze, sense, and determine appropriate forms in other languages. Only the second category, interlingual translation. I will continue interlingual, intralingual, and intersemiotic translation. The final line of the Shuttleworth and Covey definition also illustrates the potential confusion of translation with interpreting, which is strictly speaking oral translation of a spoken message or text. Yet, this confusion is seen repeatedly in everyday non-technical language use, as in the trial in the Netherlands of 2 Libyans accused of bombing an American Pan passenger jet over Lochawe, Scotland, while defense lawyers protested at the poor translation, which they said was embedding the defendant's comprehension of the proceedings. Translation also exists between different varieties of the same language and into what might be considered less conventional languages, such as Braille, Sign Language, and Morse code. What about the flexible, being understood as a country, nationality, or language? Is that translation too? Such visual phenomena are seen on a daily basis. No smoking or exit signs in public places or icons and symbols on the computer screen, such as the hourglass signifying "Tux is underway, please wait," or, as it sometimes seems, "Be patient and don't touch another key." In this particular case, it is not translation between 2 languages, but between 2 versions or dialects of the same language, as we shall see below. This is termed intralingual transition. In Roman, Jacobson's typology and by other theorists may be known as version. Yet, it does share some of the characteristics of transition between languages, notably the replacement of lexical items by other equivalent items that are considered more suited to the target audience. 1. Intralingual transition. Transition within the same language, which can evoke rewording or paraphrase. 2. Interlingual transition. Transition from one language to another and 3. Intersemiotic transition. Transition of the vowel sign by a non-vowel sign, for example, music or image. Only the second category, interlingual transition, is deemed transition proper by Jacobson. Transition between written languages remains today the core of transition research, but the focus has broadened far beyond the mere replacement of SL linguistic items with their TL equivalents. In the intervening years, research has been undertaken into all types of linguistic, cultural, and ideological phenomena around transition. In theater transition, an example of transition that is written but ultimately to be read aloud. Our threefold definition of the ambit of transition will thus be: 1. The process of transferring a written text from SL to TL, conducted by a translator or translators in a specific sociocultural context. 2. The written product or TT, which results from that process and which functions in the sociocultural context of the TL. 3. The cognitive linguistic, visual, cultural, and ideological phenomena, which are an integral part of 1 and 2. What is transition studies? Jacobson's discussion on transition centers around certain key questions of linguistics, including equivalence between items in SL and TL, and the notion of translatability. Holmes mapped out the new field like a science, dividing it into pure transition studies, encompassing descriptive studies of existing transitions and general and partial transition theories, and applied studies, covering translator training, translator aids, and transition criticism, amongst others. More priority is afforded to the pure side, the objectives of which Holmes considered to be twofold. 1. To describe the phenomena of translating and translation as they manifest themselves in the world of our experience, and 2. To establish general principles by means of which these phenomena can be explained and predicted. Here, Holmes uses translating for the process and translation for the product. The descriptions and generalized principles envisaged were much reinforced in Gideon Torrey in his descriptive translation studies and beyond 1995, where two tentative general laws of translation are proposed. 1. The law of growing standardization. TTs generally display less linguistic variation than XTs. And 2. The law of interference. Common XT lexical and syntactic patterns tend to be copied, creating unusual patterns in the TT. In both instances, the contention is that translated language in general display specific characteristics, known as universal of transition. Concept box universal of transition. Specific characteristics that it is hypothesized are typical of translated language as distinct from non-translated language. This would be the same whatever the language pair invoked, and might include greater cohesion and explicitness, with reduced ambiguity, and the fact that a TT is normally longer than a XT. See Blankenberg and Leverson, Baker and Morin and Kujemke for more on universals. The strong form of this hypothesis is that these are elements that always occur in transition, is that these are tendencies that often occur. Recent progress with corpus-based approaches have followed up suggestions by Baker to investigate universals using larger corpora, electronic database of text, in an attempt to avoid the anecdotal findings and small-scale studies. The TEC corpus, overseen by Mona Baker at the University of Manchester, UK, is one of these. Now I will say transition strategies. If we were to sample what people generally take transition to be, their consensus would most probably be for a view of translating that describe the process in terms of such features as the literal rendering of meaning, adherence to form, and emphasis on general accuracy. Form and context. Roman Jacobson makes the crucial claim that all cognitive experience and its classification is conveyable in any existing language. So, to give an example, why modern British English concepts such as the National Health Service, public-private partnership, and the conjunction churching or in the USA, Ivy League University, Homeland Security and speed dating might not exist in a different culture. That should not stop them being expressed in some way in the target language tier. Jacobson goes on to claim that only poetry, by definition, is untranslatable. Since in verse, the form of words contributes to the construction of the meaning of the text. Such statement express a classical dichotomy in transition between sense content on the one hand and form style on the other. The sense may be translated, while the form often cannot. And the point where form begins to contribute to sense is where we approach untranslatability. This clearly is more likely to be in poetry, song, advertising, penning, and so on, where sound and rhyme and double meaning are unlikely to be recreated in the tier. Literal and free. The split between form and content is linked in many ways to the major polar split, which has marked the history of Western translation theory for 2,000 years between two ways of translating, literal and free. The origin of this separation is to be found in two of the most quoted names in translation theory, the Roman lawyer and writer Cicero and Saint Jerome, who translated the Greek Septuagint Gospel into Latin in the 4th century. In classical times, it was normal for translators working from Greek to provide a literal word-for-word translation, which would serve as an aid to the Latin reader who, it could be assumed, was reasonably acquainted with the Greek source language. Cicero, describing his own translation of acted orators in 46 BCE, emphasized that he did not follow the literal word-for-word approach, but as an orator sought to preserve the general style and force of the language. 4 centuries later, Saint Jerome described his Bible translation strategy as, "I render not word for word, but sense." This approach was of particular importance for the translation of sex-sensitive text, as the Bible, deemed by many to be the repository of truth and the Word of God. A translator who did not remain true to the official interpretation of that word often ran a considerable risk. Sometimes, as in the case of the 16th century English Bible translator William Trinity, it was a mere act of transition into the vernacular that led to persecution and execution. The literal and free translation strategies can still be seen in text to the present day. The shoe cleaning machine example could be considered a literal translation of the Spanish so literal. It remains but Spanish example from a tourist brochure from a vintage train line in Maluka shows how a literal translation may be the norm between two closely related languages, in this case, ST Catalan and TT Spanish. It is easy to see that the lexical and syntactic structures are almost identical. Here, concept box translation is a pejorative general term for the language of translation. It is often used to indicate a stated form of the TL from calquing as the lexical or syntactic patterning. Translation is related to translation universal, since the characteristic mentioned above may be due to common translation phenomena, such as interference, explicitation, and domestication. We shall see how an alternative name, translators, is employed by speakback to refer to a lifeless form of the TL that homogenizes the different ST authors. Newmark uses another term, translators, to mean the automatic choice of the most common dictionary translation of a word where, in context, a less frequent alternative would be more appropriate. To illustrate this, let us consider some typical examples of translated material, which mean to define comprehension. As you read through these treatises, trying to identify features of the text that strike you as odd, and reflect on whether problems of this kind are common in languages you are familiar with. For example, what are we to make of the request of donations in this welfare organization publicity leaflet? Now we will study comprehensibility and translatability. Such literal translation often fail to take account of one simple fact of language and translation, namely that not all texts or text users are the same. Not all texts are as serious as the Bible or the works of Dickens, nor are they all as pragmatic as marriage certificates or instruction on a medicine bottle. Similarly, not all text receivers are as intellectually rigorous or culturally aware as those who read the Bible or Dickens, nor are they all as utilitarian as those who simply use translation as a means of getting things done. Ignoring such factors as text type, audience, or purpose of translation has invariably led to the rather pedantic form of literalism, target adherence to form an almost total obsession with accuracy often encountered in the translations we see or hear day in, day out. We have all come across translations where the vocabulary of a given language may well be recognizable and the grammar intact, but the sense is quite lacking. Summary. Some of the main issues of translation are linked to the strategies of literal and free translation, form and content. This division, that has marked translation for centuries, can help identify the problems of certain overly literal translation that impel comprehensibility. However, the real underlying problems of such translation lead us into areas such as text type and audience that will become central. Now, I will end my talk here. I hope you have some ideas of the distinction between translation and interpretation. Please don't forget to study your text and guide thoroughly. Good luck.